So I want you to try and imagine a world where spreading a mass casualty lie, and I mean, whether you're a high-profile journalist, some globally recognized politician, or, multinational corporate executive, instantly strips you of every single shred of legal immunity you possess.
Right, like completely gone in an instant.
Exactly. We are not talking about a world where you face a fine paid by your company or like a protracted congressional hearing that ends in just a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, the usual theater.
Right. We are talking about a reality where your deception literally lands you in a public square. You are forced to face a precisely calibrated electrical physical punishment while your entire community watches.
It's intense.
It is. And imagine this world isn't governed by the nation states we see on a modern map, right? It's governed by a supreme Pope-King, a ruler who answers only to a multi-faith global court that enforces this unyielding universal natural law.
It is just a staggering mental image to conjure up. I mean, when you look at the architecture of modern jurisprudence, we rely entirely on layers of insulation.
So much insulation.
Right. We have these endless appeals processes. We have corporate veils that shield individuals from the actual actions of their companies. We have diplomatic immunities, sovereign protection.
And all the legal fictions.
Exactly. And the vision you just described replaces all of that with something viscerally immediate. It's binary. It's completely unvarnished.
It really shatters the illusion of the modern legal system, which is exactly why we are dedicating this entire deep dive to unpacking it. Okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a system designed to just violently strip away every comfortable fiction human society has built over the last, few centuries?
At least, yeah.
Today, we're opening up a stack of incredibly complex, highly provocative sources. Specifically, we're going to explore a series of treatises, white papers, and philosophical journals written by an author named Stephen Work between the years 2025 and 2026.
Right.
He lays out this meticulously detailed blueprint for a radical new world order. He calls it the Abrahamic justice system, which is overseen by a figure holding the triple office of Pope-King man.
Which is quite the title.
It really is. But before we get into the actual mechanics of how this global court operates or why a Pope-King is wielding temporal power in the first place, we have to lay down some very strict ground rules for you, the listener.
Yeah, that is absolutely critical here. The listener needs to know right at the outset that these sources contain some highly politically charged content.
Very much so.
I mean, the author makes sweeping theological claims, specifically rooting his worldview in pre-1958 traditional Catholic perspectives. He offers these radical, foundational critiques of modern society, modern law, democratic structures, and even modern medicine.
Right. He goes after everything.
He really does. So we are not here to endorse, validate, or take sides on literally any of these viewpoints, whether the author is discussing theology, historical events, abortion, euthanasia, or, the authoritarian structure of government itself. Our goal is strictly to impartially report on the architecture of his ideas.
We're just looking at the blueprints.
Exactly. We are exploring the internal logic of the text. We just want to convey the fascinating, albeit highly intense concepts contained in the original source material exactly as the author lays them out.
Yeah, think of us as your guides through an extremely severe philosophical landscape. We're not telling you this map is the right way to navigate the world. We are literally just showing you the specific routes the author has drawn and, where they ultimately lead.
Right.
So to understand this blueprint, we have to follow the author's logic from the ground up. We're going to start with his diagnosis of the modern world, what he calls a terminal sickness of the soul.
A very light topic.
Oh, yeah, very light. And then from there, we have to understand his proposed truth enforcement system, which relies heavily on public physical consequences.
Which is where it gets very visceral.
Exactly. Then we'll look at the global architecture required to enforce this, the multi-faith Abrahamic court. And finally, we'll examine the ultimate executor of this justice, the Pope-King himself.
And honestly, following that progression is really the only way this text makes any sense. Yeah, because if you jump straight to the public electrical punishment or the abolition of all global immunities, it just sounds like arbitrary cruelty.
It sounds unhinged, frankly.
Yeah, right. To understand why he proposes a cure that drastic, you have to first understand the sheer scale of the disease he believes has infected the global population.
So let's start right there with that diagnosis. The author operates on the premise that the modern world is suffering from this terminal moral sickness. And he traces this back to the actual mechanism of how societies change their minds about what is right and wrong.
He draws a very sharp defining line here.
He does. A line between moral changes that happen through persuasion versus moral changes that are forced upon a population through coercion.
And that distinction is really the bedrock of his entire societal critique. He argues there are fundamentally two ways a society shifts its moral stance. The first is persuasion. Persuasion is that slow, messy, generational work of cultural shift. It involves religious conversion, rigorous democratic debate, philosophical arguments in the public square, and, the engagement of individual conscience.
Right, it takes time.
Exactly. In the author's view, even if a society is persuaded of something that he personally considers to be morally wrong, the human faculties of the citizens, their reason, their conscience, their free will, they remain fully engaged.
They're active participants in the moral direction of their community.
Yes, but coercion operates completely differently on the human psyche.
Entirely differently.
Yeah.
And he defines coercion in the specific context as state-compelled moral acceptance.
Right.
This happens when a moral position is backed by the overwhelming legal sanction of the state and its monopoly on force, just completely bypassing any democratic deliberation.
The individual citizen isn't asked to reason toward a conclusion or debate its merits at all. They are simply required to accept its practical consequences.
Yeah, they have to fund it through their tax dollars. They must integrate it as a background social fact in their workplaces. And most importantly, they are forbidden from legally opposing it.
Right. And he anchors this entirely theoretical concept to a very specific historical event.
He points to the 1973 United States Supreme Court decision, Roe v. Wade, as basically patient zero for this kind of institutional harm in the modern era.
Yeah, and keeping our impartiality in mind here, he's not just arguing against the moral outcome of the ruling regarding abortion.
Right, his primary critique here is structural. It's anthropological.
Yeah, exactly. He focuses heavily on the fact that an unelected court struck down the abortion statutes of all 50 states by judicial fiat, without a single vote cast by any citizen in any democratic forum.
He uses the term judicial imposition for this.
He does, and according to his framework, when the state forces society to accept a highly contested moral premise from the top down, it inflicts profound structural damage. In this specific historical case, he argues the state declared that personhood is merely a legal grant determined by the government, rather than an inherent biological or ontological reality.
And when the law decrees a profound moral shift from above like that, and prevents any democratic removal from below, it places the citizen in a perpetual state of compulsion. The law isn't just regulating behavior anymore, right? It's acting as this mandatory moral instructor.
Exactly. And I want to spend some real time digging into that concept of damage, because he doesn't just broadly gesture and say, oh, this is bad for society.
No, he gets incredibly granular about how this coercion actually damages the human person. This is where the text gets really interdisciplinary, which I found fascinating.
It really is.
He takes the medieval theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, written way back in the 13th century, and he maps it directly onto modern 20th and 21st century psychological concepts.
It's honestly one of the most intellectually ambitious syntheses in the source material.
Walk me through it.
Well, St. Thomas Aquinas taught that sin, or participation in objective moral wrong, isn't just a matter of accruing abstract guilt on some cosmic ledger. Aquinas argued that it inflicts positive functional damage on human capacities.
Okay.
He identified 4 specific wounds of sin that degrade our ability to function as rational creatures. And the author takes these 4 medieval concepts and finds their exact correlates in contemporary peer-reviewed psychological models.
Okay, let's walk through these 4 wounds, because they're so crucial for understanding the rest of his legal system. The first Thomistic wound is ignorance. Aquinas defined this as the darkening of the intellect. It's the impaired capacity to perceive moral reality clearly.
Right, and the author aligns this medieval wound of ignorance with Albert Bandura's psychological theory of moral disengagement.
Oh, Bandura, yeah.
Bandura was a highly influential psychologist who studied how perfectly normal people can selectively disengage their moral reasoning to facilitate or tolerate harmful actions.
So they diffuse responsibility, or rely heavily on bureaucratic euphemisms, right? Or distance themselves cognitively from the victims of a policy.
Exactly. In the author's view, when a society is forced to accept a judicial fiat that violates natural law, the population uses moral disengagement as a coping mechanism.
Just to get by.
Yes. To survive in that society without constantly feeling the friction of moral conflict, citizens effectively disable their own moral alarm systems.
Over a period of decades, the intellect is literally darkened.
That's his argument. They can no longer recognize the objective reality of the act because the institution has provided them with all the euphemisms needed to ignore it.
That concept makes total sense. If you think about how people survive in heavily bureaucratic or authoritarian systems, you stop seeing the reality of the action because the institution tells you, well, it's standard operating procedure.
You just process the paperwork.
Right. Moving to the second Thomistic wound, we have malice. And Aquinas described this not as, like, cackling villainy, but as the corruption of the will.
Right. It leads to an instrumental orientation toward others.
Where you view people as objects to be used, resulting in the erosion of genuine care.
And the psychological correlate the author brings in here is the development of callous unemotional traits, often abbreviated as CU traits in developmental psychology.
Okay, CU traits.
Studies show that these traits, which include reduced empathy, shallow emotional affect, and a tendency to use others for one's own ends, they emerge and solidify when individuals are chronically exposed to environments where harm to vulnerable others is normalized and systematically ignored.
So the author argues that state-sanctioned moral coercion creates exactly this kind of toxic environment, not just in a single household, but at a macro societal scale.
Exactly. When the state normalizes what the author views as objective harm, the population adapts by developing societal callousness.
It's basically a defense mechanism that calcifies into a personality trait.
Yes.
Okay, the third wound is weakness. Aquinas defined this as the inability to resist temptation or the total collapse of self-governance when put under pressure.
For this wound, the author points to Martin Seligman's famous psychological model of learned helplessness.
I remember this one. Seligman demonstrated that if an organism is subjected to a painful or adverse environment where its choices have absolutely no effect on the outcome, it eventually just stops trying to escape or resist.
Even when an opportunity later presents itself, yes.
Right.
The author applies this to the civic sphere. If you are subjected to an environment where moral reality is imposed on you by unelected courts or vast state bureaucracies, and where resisting that imposition carries incredibly high social, financial, or professional costs,
you progressively lose your perceived agency.
exactly, your will weakens. You learn to be helpless in the face of massive institutional momentum. You tell yourself, well, there's nothing I can do to change the law, so why fight it?
And the final wound of the four is concupiscence. This is traditionally understood as disordered desire.
Right.
It's the state where human appetite completely tyrannizes reason, and we prioritize immediate emotional or physical gratification over higher, long-term goods.
Here, the author integrates modern psychological literature on reward dysregulation and hedonic adaptation. He argues that when a society is built on the fundamental premise of absolute personal autonomy, which he identifies as the underlying philosophical engine of the Roe decision and similar legal shifts, the natural obligation to dependent life is fundamentally subordinated to personal preference.
So the society becomes legally and culturally structured around emotional fulfillment and self-actualization at the expense of duty. Desire overrides reason, and the legal framework exists primarily to facilitate that desire.
That's his view, yes.
So if we look at this diagnosis comprehensively, he's saying that by forcing a contested moral position onto the populace without democratic persuasion, the state effectively inflicts these four wounds: ignorance, malice, weakness, and concupiscence on the collective human psyche.
Yes. But the author argues the damage doesn't stay contained to that one single issue. He says this initiates what he calls a moral cascade.
Okay, the moral cascade.
It's a vital concept for understanding his worldview. It describes how the forced acceptance of a primary wrong progressively destroys the societal resistance to subsequent expanding wrongs.
Because the human faculties that should naturally resist the intellect and the will are already darkened and weakened by those four wounds.
Exactly. So each new moral boundary crossed is justified using the legal and logical principles established by the previous one.
And he traces this cascade explicitly in the realm of bioethics and medicine. He argues that once the state legally assumed the power to determine who possesses personhood and who doesn't in 1973, that power naturally creeps outward. It doesn't remain static.
It cannot remain static because the internal logic of the premise demands expansion. If personhood is merely a legal grant bestowed by the state based on certain capacities or stages of development, rather than an inherent reality of being human, that logic will inevitably migrate to other populations. The source material meticulously tracks how euthanasia and medical assistance in dying have expanded across various global jurisdictions. He notes that initially, these practices were strictly legalized for adults with terminal illnesses and a foreseeable imminent death.
framed purely as compassion at the very end of life.
Exactly. But then it expanded to chronic, non-terminal physical conditions. From there, it expanded to the psychiatric suffering and severe mental illness, where the body is perfectly healthy, but the mind is in distress.
And he even cites a specific international example that represents to him the extreme endpoint of this logic, the Groningen Protocol.
Yes, the Groningen Protocol was established in the Netherlands around 2004. It outlines the specific medical criteria and procedures under which physicians can actively end the lives of severely disabled newborns who are deemed to be suffering unbearably, even though the infants obviously cannot consent. The author points to this as the inevitable, mathematically certain endpoint of the moral cascade he diagnosed earlier. The logic of state-determined personhood and the prioritization of autonomy over inherent value is iteratively applied to populations that historically, under common law and natural law, receive the absolute highest levels of protection precisely because of their extreme vulnerability.
Like the elderly, the disabled, the cognitively impaired, and infants.
Yes.
And society accepts this expansion, he argues, because the moral alarm system, that Thomistic intellect, has been profoundly darkened by decades of learned helplessness and moral disengagement.
Right.
Which brings us to the author's fascinating term for the modern citizen produced by this environment. He calls this person Homo umbrans.
Homo umbrans, translating from the Latin, the shadow human.
The shadow human. You know, when I was reading this section of the text, I was trying to visualize exactly what he meant. I thought of it like an analogy. Imagine forcing someone to wear a heavy, lopsided backpack from the time they're a child. For years, they carry this unnatural weight. Eventually, their spine physically curves to accommodate it. They might still function perfectly well in society. They go to work, they smile at their neighbors, they pay their taxes. But structurally, on a skeletal level, they are permanently deformed.
That's a powerful way to put it.
The author seems to be saying that our collective moral spine has curved to accommodate the heavy weight of compelled lies and institutional fictions.
Yeah, Homo umbrans is the person with the curved spine. They have diminished rational agency, their self-governance is heavily weakened, and because their internal compass is broken, they are highly susceptible to whatever ideological direction the state or the culture dictates.
So we have the diagnosis firmly established. We're looking at a globally curved moral spine. The faculties we need to recognize truth are wounded by decades of institutional falsehood and coercion. The natural question then is, how does the author propose we fix this? I mean, you can't just mandate 1 billion people to suddenly stand up straight and heal their spines.
No, you cannot. And the author acknowledges that you cannot fix a crisis created by bureaucratic coercion with more of the exact same kind of bureaucratic coercion.
Right.
If a new, highly traditional government came into power and simply imposed a new set of right-wing or traditional legal fictions via judicial fiat, it wouldn't heal the underlying human faculties.
It would just impose a new set of conditions on a broken system. The citizen would still be Homo umbrans, just reciting a different set of mandated slogans.
Exactly. Because society's moral faculties have been so thoroughly dimmed by institutional falsehoods, he argues that our modern justice systems are catastrophically failing. They fail because they focus on managing the symptoms of the decay rather than punishing the root cause of the rot.
And to the author, the root cause is always the lie.
The lie itself, false witnessing.
Yes. Therefore, the cure he proposes is a severe, uncompromising, Thomistic truth enforcement justice system. This is where the source material pivots from sociological critique to radical legal architecture.
Big time.
Under this proposed system, lying is not just considered a social faux pas, a minor inconvenience, or something politicians do to win elections. It is treated as an offense of the absolute highest order. It fundamentally rewrites how we classify crime.
He relies heavily on the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas here. Aquinas identifies false witnessing, deliberate lying that causes harm, as a triple offense. It is not a single crime. It is 3 simultaneous violations of the natural order.
Let's break down those 3 layers. The text states the first is an offense against God. Now, we are talking about a legal system here, so how does theology become jurisprudence in this context?
Well, in the Thomistic philosophical framework that the author adopts, God is not just a distant creator. God is fundamentally identical with truth itself, veritas ipsum.
Yeah.
Therefore, every deliberate conscious lie is an act inherently oriented against the very nature of God and reality. It is an act of cosmic disorder. It introduces non-reality into reality. So it is not just a local harm against a neighbor, it is a rebellion against the structure of existence.
Wow. Okay, and the second offense is against justice.
Yes. Classical justice is defined as giving each person what is properly due to them. When you lie to someone, you are actively stealing the truth from your neighbor. They have a right to navigate reality based on facts.
Right. And the author points out that unlike stealing of physical objects like a car or a wallet, which can be returned or reimbursed, a destroyed reputation or a false historical narrative injected into the public consciousness cannot simply be undone.
Exactly. The damage to the fabric of justice is often permanent.
And the third layer is an offense against charity.
Charity, in this classical sense, means the active love of neighbor. We owe our fellow human beings active goodwill, which is primarily expressed in truthfulness. Deliberately withholding the truth, or substituting a fiction, is an active, hostile violation of that required charity.
You're purposefully leading your neighbor into darkness.
Yes.
So because false witnessing is this massive triple-layered offense that attacks God, justice, and charity simultaneously, the punishment system he designs for it is, well, intense is an understatement. And the first thing that jumps out is who is actually held accountable under this system. He argues for the complete, total abolition of all artificial immunities.
This is arguably one of the most structurally radical legal proposals in the entire text. It dismantles the entire framework of global business and diplomacy. The author insists on a foundational principle. Office amplifies accountability. It does not reduce it.
That concept that your title makes you more vulnerable to punishment, not less, turns our current global system completely upside down.
Entirely. I mean, if you analyze modern legal systems, we have spent centuries building massive, impenetrable architectures of immunity.
Yeah, we rely on the corporate veil, a legal fiction which dictates that a corporation is its own distinct legal entity. This protects CEOs, executives, and board members from facing personal physical liability for the catastrophic actions or lies of the company they run.
We have diplomatic immunity, which allows foreign representatives to bypass local laws. We have sovereign immunity, which protects governments from being sued by their own citizens.
We even have legislative immunity, which protects politicians from being sued for defamation for things they say on the floor of a parliament or Congress.
And the author looks at all of that and says it is completely invalid. It all has to go.
Just gone.
In the Thomistic framework, human law is only valid if it is derived directly from natural law. Any human law that deflects from or contradicts natural law is, using Aquinas' exact terminology, a perversion of law. It's an act of violence, not a law.
So the author argues that protecting a human being from the natural consequences of their grave, lies simply because they possess a fancy job title or sit on a corporate board, is a gross perversion of justice.
Exactly. If an average citizen lies under oath and goes to jail, but a politician lies to 50 million people and suffers no consequence because of their office, the system is fundamentally broken.
Under his truth enforcement system, that title should subject the politician to a significantly harsher penalty, because the destructive reach of their lie was artificially amplified by the power of their office.
It's a fascinating paradigm shift, but he goes even further. It is not just the person who stands at the podium and tells the original lie who gets punished. It is anyone who helped that lie reach the public. The system aggressively targets the enablers and the amplifiers.
This is where the author applies the complex moral doctrine of cooperation in evil, right?
Yes.
The author proposes that media owners, newspaper editors, television broadcasters, and even the financiers who fund the platforms that propagate a lie are held proportionately accountable under the law.
Let's walk through a hypothetical to make sure we understand the mechanism here, because this would completely rewrite the media landscape.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's say a high-ranking intelligence official deliberately falsifies a report claiming a foreign nation is preparing an imminent attack, and they leak this lie to a major news network to drum up support for a war. What happens to the editor who runs this story?
Under the system, the court would examine the editor's actions through the lens of cooperation. The system distinguishes primarily between formal cooperation and proximate material cooperation.
Okay, so formal cooperation means?
If the court finds that the editor engaged in formal cooperation, meaning the editor knew the intelligence was falsified, but ran the story anyway because it aligned with their political goals or, boosted ratings, they share the exact same guilt as the intelligence official.
Wow.
The editor intended the harm. They took a lie known to maybe 10 people in a back room and weaponized it, multiplying it to 50 million households.
So the editor is completely on the hook for the full punishment.
Yeah.
But what if they didn't know it was a lie, but they just didn't do their job?
That would fall under proximate material cooperation. If the editor didn't explicitly want to start a war based on a lie, but they were culpably negligent, Perhaps they failed to exercise the reasonable, rigorous diligence their journalistic profession demands, or they published something a reasonable person in their position should have recognized as highly suspect without verifying it. They are still severely punished.
They are not merely a passive conduit. Their negligence facilitated the harm.
Right. And institutional enablers, like the media corporation itself, would face complete dissolution, and all profits, even tangentially related to the propagation of the lie, would be disgorged and seized by the court.
Okay, so the corporate veil is pierced, the immunities are stripped, the intelligence official and the media executive are both found guilty of formal false witnessing. What actually happens to their physical bodies?
This is where the text moves from theoretical jurisprudence to incredibly visceral physical reality. The punishment protocol in this society is centered around two deeply intertwined concepts: infamia and physical correction. Infamia translates to the public loss of good reputation.
In the modern world, we often view reputation as a mere social construct.
But Aquinas considered a good name to be a genuine, objective human good, directly comparable to physical wealth or health. Therefore, for a punishment to be just, it must involve a public, felt, undeniable diminishment of the offender's standing in the community they deceived.
The punishment cannot happen behind closed doors in a pristine prison facility. It has to be public.
It absolutely must be public. The deterrence function of the law requires the community to witness the consequence of the deception, and the consequence itself involves a graduated corrective pain protocol. Specifically, for significant false witnessing, the author proposes calibrated electrical stimulation.
Essentially judicial tasering.
Exactly.
Tasering in a public square for lying.
Yes. It would be executed at a publicly known location at a specifically announced time so the community can gather. The intensity, the duration, and the repetition of the electrical stimulation are not arbitrary. They are strictly calibrated by a judicial determination based on a complex matrix.
What's in the matrix?
It looks at the severity of the lie, the degree of malice or intent, the magnitude of the harm caused to victims, the offender's social or political position, and whether they have a history of prior offenses.
Now, reading this, it immediately sounds like a human rights violation waiting to happen.
Yeah.
But the author does build in medical exclusions, correct? He's not advocating for tasering an 80-year-old executive with a heart condition until they have a heart attack.
That is a critical nuance to maintain our understanding of his internal logic. The system strictly mandates medical exclusions. Individuals with cardiac conditions, pacemakers, pregnant women, those with severe respiratory issues, or those of advanced frailty are medically exempt from the electrical protocol. And the author insists these are not loopholes for the rich to escape justice. Rather, they are constitutive requirements of just administration. The entire goal of this specific punishment is a proportionate, corrective experience of acute pain intended to break the pride of the liar. It is not intended to cause permanent physiological injury or death.
Right. Inflicting death when the sentence calls for corrective pain would violate the Thomistic principle of proportionality.
Exactly.
But wait, we have to address the extreme end of this spectrum, because for the absolute worst lies, the punishment does involve intentional death. The author outlines a category for mass casualty deception.
Yes, for the most extreme tier of crimes, which he categorizes as treasonous false witnesses. This applies to a person who propagates massive mass casualty falsehoods, perhaps in service to a foreign power against their own community.
Or a head of state whose deliberate manufactured lie initiates an unjust war.
Exactly. For these apex crimes against humanity, the truth enforcement system employs the ancient principle of lex talionis.
Lex talionis, the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye.
Exactly. In this specific tier, the punishment must perfectly mirror the physical harm the lie caused to the innocent. The text gives a highly specific, chilling example. Let us say a politician's deliberate deception caused an unjust military conflict, and during that conflict, soldiers burned to death in their vehicles or civilians died in incendiary bombings.
Oh, wait.
Under the system, that politician, having been found guilty of formal mass casualty false witnessing, is put to death by fire.
Death by fire. Literally burning a politician at the stake, because that is the exact fate they inflicted on others through their deception. And this applies to the enablers, too.
The Talion consequence extends proportionately to the enablers and amplifiers whose active participation made the mass casualties possible. If the intelligence official fabricated the lie, and the media editor deliberately and formally amplified the lie knowing it was false, making the war possible, they both share in the blood guilt. They would both face the Talion consequence.
I have to pause here and really grapple with this, because reading this, the modern mind recoils. An eye for an eye, burning a politician or a media CEO at the stake. If we strip away the Latin terms, isn't this just pure, unadulterated vengeance? It sounds medieval. It sounds like state-sanctioned mob justice dressed up in theological language.
It is entirely expected that the modern mind recoils. The author anticipates that exact objection. To defend his system, he draws a rigid, absolute philosophical line between vengeance, which is driven by human passion and hatred, and vindication, which is driven by objective justice. He roots this severe protocol strictly in Thomas Aquinas' four ends of punishment.
Okay, if a punishment does not meet all four ends, he agrees it is cruelty. But if it meets all four, he argues it is a moral necessity. Walk me through those four ends.
Yeah.
Because to justify burning someone alive, the philosophical load-bearing walls of this argument have to be incredibly strong.
Every penalty executed in this system, from the public tasering to the lex talionis, must serve these four ends simultaneously. First is retributive justice. In the modern world, we often conflate retribution with revenge. But in classical theology, retribution is essentially moral mathematics.
Moral mathematics?
Yeah, it is the necessary act of restoring the objective moral order that was violently unbalanced by the crime. It pays the debt incurred. Second is deterrence. The punishment must be severe and public enough to genuinely discourage both the offender and the observing community from ever contemplating a similar deception.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the third?
Third is rehabilitation. The author argues that experiencing the profound physical consequence of their lie strips away the offender's pride and offers them a genuine, visceral path to moral conversion and repentance before they face eternal judgment.
And the fourth end?
The protection of the common good. The state has an absolute duty to shield society from continued harm by permanently neutralizing those who cause mass death.
So his argument is that if the punishment perfectly aligns with all four of those criteria, retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, and protection, it transcends cruelty and becomes perfect justice.
According to his Thomistic framework, yes. A penalty that serves none of these ends, or is administered purely out of anger, is mere cruelty. But a penalty that serves all four proportionately is the highest expression of civic love. And he insists it must be administered by legitimate judicial authority, operating with a cold, exact moral calculus, entirely devoid of private passion, hatred, or spectacle.
But the idea of removing spectacle is really hard to swallow when you read his requirement for how this justice is witnessed. Because to ensure the community truly internalizes this moral calculus, he introduces a requirement that is, frankly, mind-bending: mandatory youth witnessing.
Yes, the text mandates that before a person turns 15 years old, which the system designates as the age of full moral and civic accountability, they are required to witness at least one public punishment of a false witness.
Let me just visualize this. A 14-year-old child is required by law to stand in a public square and watch an adult human being receive calibrated electrical shocks for lying.
That is the proposal. But again, the author puts very strict, almost ritualistic parameters around this event to prevent it from degrading into a traumatic, chaotic spectacle. The youth cannot just wander into the square. They must be accompanied by their father, or if the father is absent, a designated male mentor of confirmed good moral standing in the community.
Why a father figure specifically? Why not a mother or a teacher?
The text ties this explicitly to traditional concepts of the natural domestic order and the paternal duty of formation. He uses the term the officium patris, the office of the father. The father's role in this moment is not just to stand there silently. He has a highly specific active duty.
What's the duty?
While the punishment is occurring, the father must explain the exact nature of the offense to the youth. He must detail the real-world harm the lie caused to innocent people, and he must articulate the theological reasoning behind the punishment. He is required to explain that what they're witnessing is the difficult work of justice and charity, not random cruelty.
That is a surreal conversation to imagine. Look at this man screaming in the square, son. This is an act of charity.
It sounds utterly paradoxical to modern ears, but in the author's Thomistic view, pain is the natural, inevitable language of consequence in a fallen world. The father is meant to look the youth in the eye and deliver a profound warning. You are about to turn 15. You will soon be subject to these exact same laws as an adult citizen. If you live a life of integrity and tell the truth, you have absolutely nothing to fear from this system. But if you choose to lie, if you deceive your neighbors and cause harm, you will stand exactly where that man stands, and no one will protect you.
Wow. The ultimate scared straight program. The goal is complete moral habituation. It's an attempt to give the youth a visceral, embodied, unforgettable encounter with the reality of consequence before they enter adult civic life.
Precisely. To return to your earlier analogy, this is how the system ensures the moral spine is straightened before the weight of adult temptation ever has a chance to curve it.
Okay, we have outlined this incredibly intense, physical, truth-enforcing justice system. We understand the theory behind it, but the logistical question immediately arises. How do you actually implement this globally? If you are a local district court, you cannot summon the CEO of a trillion-dollar multinational tech company based on another continent and order them to be tasered in your town square.
You really can't.
To execute a system that strips world leaders and global corporations of their immunity, you need an architecture that completely transcends nation-states. You need a supranational, legally binding framework. This brings us to the structure the author calls the Abrahamic justice system.
The author is highly pragmatic on this point. He understands that a fractured world of competing sovereign nation-states cannot hold massive corporate or political entities accountable. The jurisdiction of truth must be universal, or it is useless.
And so he constructs a new global Supreme Court. But what's fascinating is that the composition of this court isn't based on geography or economic power or population size. It's based entirely on religion.
Yes. The Supreme Court of the Abrahamic justice system is composed of exactly 9 justices, but they are strictly apportioned by faith: 3 Christian justices, 3 Muslim justices, and 3 Jewish justices.
Why those 3 specific faiths? And how do 3 vastly different theological traditions who have historically warred with each other over doctrine possibly agree on how to run a global court?
Well, they represent the major Abrahamic faiths, which the author sees as the foundational religious pillars of Western and Middle Eastern civilization. The court is explicitly not designed to debate specific sectarian theology, like the nature of the Trinity or the exact dietary laws. Instead, it is designed to enforce what the author calls the Abrahamic core and universal natural law.
I need you to explain natural law here like I'm a 5-year-old, because that seems to be the glue holding this court together. How does it bridge the theological gap?
Think of natural law as the intersecting Venn diagram of human reason, separate from specific divine revelation. Natural law posits that there is an objective moral order built into the very fabric of human nature and the universe, and this order can be discovered by human reason alone, regardless of what holy book you read.
Right.
The Abrahamic core relies on the baseline moral agreements found in all 3 traditions: prohibitions on murder, theft, false witnessing, the protection of innocent life, the defense of the family unit, and the dignity of the human person.
And the math of the court 3 justices from each faith ensures that no single sect can achieve a majority of 5 to dominate the court and impose its specific religious rituals on the others.
Exactly. They are structurally forced to find consensus based purely on universally accessible natural law.
But this immediately raises a massive red flag for anyone reading this text. A global religious Supreme Court enforcing its judgments with public tasering and executions.
Yeah.
The modern secular mind hears that and instantly screams theocracy or global inquisition. What happens to everyone else? What happens to atheists in Europe? Or a Buddhist community in Thailand? Or a secular democracy? Is this a forced conversion scenario where the Papal-King's armies march in and demand baptism?
It is a vital question, and the author addresses it explicitly through a concept he calls strict limits and defensive jurisdiction. He is adamant that the system is strictly defensive. The text emphasizes repeatedly that no individual is forced to convert to an Abrahamic faith, no one is forced to observe a Sabbath, attend a religious service, or adhere to specific religious rituals.
The jurisdiction of the court is fundamentally protective, not expansionist.
Yes.
So if you are a completely secular society in Scandinavia or a Hindu community in India, does this Abrahamic court rule over your daily life?
The short answer is no, provided you do not cross fundamental lines. If those non-participant communities do not commit grave systemic violations of the universal basic standards of natural law, such as committing genocide, operating mass euthanasia programs, or engaging in the systematic persecution and murder of religious worshipers, they remain completely outside the Abrahamic court's coercive reach.
Interesting.
The court exercises only a ministry of witness, persuasion, and mediation toward those outside societies. The coercive power, the physical punishments, the stripping of immunities is only triggered defensively. It is deployed as a shield to protect the vulnerable when fundamental natural law is being violently assaulted.
Okay, so the author envisions it as a defensive shield against atrocities, not a conquering sword looking for heretics. But what if other faiths want to be part of this system? What if a massive global tradition, like Hinduism or Buddhism, recognizes the value of this system and wants representation on the global court? Are they permanently locked out because they aren't Abrahamic?
The author builds in a highly specific, democratic inclusion mechanism. Non-Abrahamic sects can petition for inclusion into the global architecture. If a tradition gathers verified signatures from 10% of their total adult adherents globally, they formally enter what the author designates as a 10-year advisory period.
A 10-year probationary phase.
Essentially, yes. During this decade, the petitioning faith is granted a representative on the Supreme Court. This representative has profound advisory influence, the ability to speak, debate, and review evidence, but they possess no binding voting rights.
Okay, so they're in the room.
Right. This decade-long period serves as a rigorous real-world test. It determines whether the representative brings demonstrable, unique value and wisdom to the court's deliberations, and crucially, whether the petitioning faith can sustain its commitment to the universal principles of natural law in its own communities over time. If they prove valuable and faithful over that decade, they receive a final vote of acceptance from the existing justices, and they are integrated into the court as full, permanent voting members.
So the system begins with an Abrahamic foundation, but its architecture is deliberately designed to expand and encompass other global traditions, provided they align with the baseline of natural law. It seeks cumulative global consent over time, rather than demanding immediate submission.
Correct. It is an organically expanding system of natural justice.
I want to shift gears to how this court handles the economic titans of the world. Because earlier, we talked about stripping the corporate veil. But practically speaking, how does a religious court sitting in an Abrahamic center actually enforce judgments against a massive, faceless, multinational entity like a global tech giant or an international energy consortium? These entities often have more wealth and resources than mid-sized countries.
The author is acutely aware of that power dynamic. He recognizes that multinational corporations often wield political and economic influence that easily eclipses sovereign states. To rein them in and strip away their ability to hide behind international borders, the system introduces a mechanism called the host country mandate.
Let's trace how that mandate works in reality.
Under this law, the era of stateless, floating multinational corporations ends. Every corporation operating globally must legally designate a single host country. This forces a sovereign state to take ultimate, profound responsibility for the economic and destructive power it chooses to harbor within its borders.
And it is not just a paperwork exercise.
Not at all. The host country must secure a guaranteed financial bond equal to 50% of the corporation's maximum calculated potential damage to human life or the environment.
That is a staggering financial requirement. Walk me through the math on that. Let's say a global chemical company wants to base its headquarters in a European country. And the court actuaries calculate that if one of their massive plants exploded, or if they dumped toxic waste, it could cause $1 billion in environmental devastation and human health costs.
In that scenario, before the company is allowed to operate, the host country has to secure a bond holding $500 million in liquid assets. Furthermore, the sovereign state itself must mandatorily insure the remaining 50%, or $500 million, using its own national treasury.
Wow. This mechanism achieves two massive paradigm shifts simultaneously. First, it ensures there is a fully guaranteed, immediately accessible fund for victim restitution before any damage even occurs. Victims do not have to spend 20 years fighting in court while a corporation declares bankruptcy to avoid paying out.
Right. And second, it radically alters state behavior. It forces the sovereign host government to exercise extreme prudence, rigorous regulation, and constant oversight over the corporation.
It aligns their incentives perfectly.
Yeah.
If the chemical company acts destructively or engages in mass deception about the safety of its products, the host state's own treasury is directly on the hook. You couldn't afford to be a corrupt politician looking the other way in exchange for campaign donations because a corporate disaster would bankrupt your own government.
Precisely. And remember, in this system, the corporate veil does not exist. If the chemical company engages in mass false witnessing regarding a toxic spill, the Abrahamic court doesn't merely confiscate the bond money and let the executives resign with golden parachutes. The court surgically identifies the specific human beings, the executives, the board members, the internal regulators, who directed or culpably ignored the violations. And it holds those specific individuals physically and personally accountable in the public square.
Which brings me to the absolute most controversial part of this section of the text: familial culpability. When we talk about holding individuals accountable, the text states that parents can be punished if their adult child becomes a false witness. Let me read this right from the source material. The multi-generational decay of virtue stems from the active destruction of fatherhood and the healthy family unit. Now, I have to push back on this. If my 30-year-old son commits a mass casualty lie, the court can investigate me. Isn't this explicitly punishing the innocent? It sounds exactly like North Korean generational punishment, where entire bloodlines are thrown into gulags for the crime of one person.
It is absolutely vital to draw a razor-sharp distinction here, because the author's proposal is fundamentally different from vicarious punishment. Thomas Aquinas, and therefore this system, categorically rejects vicarious punishment. You are never, under any circumstances, punished for the sin your child committed. That would violate justice.
Then what am I being punished for if I am standing in the public square because of my son's crime?
You are punished strictly for your own independent, verifiable offense. The author defines this offense as culpable formative failure. In the Thomistic worldview, parents possess a quasi-legal, absolute duty of moral formation toward their children. This is the officium parentis.
So let's use a clear example.
If a 30-year-old executive is convicted of massive corporate fraud, the court will investigate his background. If the court uncovers evidence that you, as the parent, actively corrupted the child, perhaps you taught them how to cheat on their taxes when they were a teenager, or you praised and rewarded their deceptive behavior to get ahead in sports or academics, you have committed a crime.
Or, if I was culpably negligent, completely abandoning my duty to provide basic moral instruction when I had the full capacity to do so, I have failed my office.
Yes, you are punished for that specific failure of your parental duty, not for the fraud your son committed.
So the burden of proof is incredibly high. The court has to prove that my specific, verifiable failure as a parent directly created the corrupt moral conditions that led to my child's crime.
Exactly. It requires highly precise, individualized judicial distinction. If the court investigates and finds that you formed the child rightly in virtue, that you taught them honesty, and that the child simply freely chose a corrupt path as an adult, using their own free will, you bear absolutely zero legal culpability and cannot be touched by this system.
Furthermore, if I was incapacitated, severely ill, or absent through circumstances beyond my control, my culpability is proportionately reduced or completely eliminated.
You are judged entirely on your own failure to execute the duty of formation you owed to the child and to society.
It introduces an intense, almost terrifying level of accountability to the acts of parenthood. It elevates raising a child from a private domestic lifestyle choice to a matter of supreme state and spiritual security.
It fundamentally recognizes the family as the primary foundational society that exists prior to the state. The author believes that the modern world is decaying precisely because we have removed all consequences from the failure of fatherhood and parenthood. Restoring accountability to the origin point of human formation is, in his view, essential for any lasting societal correction.
Okay, let's pull all these threads together. We have the diagnosis, the shadow human, homo umbrans, wandering in a state of moral disengagement. We have the cure, a public, physical, truth-enforcing justice system that strips away all immunities and holds individuals, enablers, and even negligent parents accountable. And we have the global framework, the multi-faith Abrahamic court, backed by massive economic host country mandates.
Right.
But this brings us to the final, most crucial piece of the puzzle. The court issues the judgments, it pierces the corporate veils, it calculates the lex talionis. But a court without an enforcer is just a high-minded debate club who actually carries out these severe sentences, who steps into the public square to taser the corrupt CEO, who oversees the execution of the treasonous politician.
This brings us to the author's most radical, defining structural proposal, the triple office of Pope-King man. This is where all the distinct threads of the author's treatises, the medieval theology, the radical political science, and the deeply personal elements fully converge into a single focal point.
To understand the necessity and the function of the Pope-King, we first have to look at the author's highly specific view of the Catholic Church's current spiritual crisis. He believes the institutional church is fundamentally broken, and he points to a very specific timeline, dating the crisis back to 1958.
Yes, the author operates from a theological framework often associated with deprivationism or extreme traditional Catholicism regarding the modern papacy. Let's break that down simply. He claims that beginning specifically with the papal election of 1958, the highest offices of the Catholic Church in Rome were systematically infiltrated by adherents of modernism.
Now, Pope Pius X in the early 20th century officially defined modernism as the synthesis of all heresies. It's a philosophy that essentially strips the divine and objective truth out of religion and reduces it to evolving human sentiment.
The author also brings in mystical elements to support this, specifically mentioning the third secret of Fatima.
Ah, yes.
The apparitions at Fatima, Portugal in 1917 are highly significant in traditional Catholic circles. The author points to the historical failure of the Pope in 1958 to release the true, unredacted text of the third secret of Fatima to the public in 1960, which was when the Virgin Mary supposedly directed it to be revealed.
He believes, along with many traditionalists, that the true secret contained explicit, dire warnings of a demonic infiltration reaching the very apex of the Vatican.
His theological premise is this: because these modernist clerics accepted their papal and episcopal offices with a hidden, objective intent to alter or harm the traditional church, they erected an obstacle to grace. Therefore, while they may legally occupy the buildings and hold the legal titles, they never received the specific supernatural graces, the Holy Ghost protections, or the divine authority that normally accompany those offices.
So he is describing a massive spiritual power vacuum. The current structures in Rome are legally occupied, but they are spiritually dead and graceless.
Exactly. And because the institutional, visible church is paralyzed by this modernist infiltration, it is entirely incapable of correcting itself, let alone providing the moral clarity needed to heal a world full of homo umbrans. Therefore, the author concludes that the solution requires an extraordinary, almost unprecedented intervention to bypass the corrupted hierarchy. A purified remnant of the College of Cardinals must convene to elect a true traditional pope.
And this is where the text takes a fascinating turn from the abstract into the highly personal. The author actually uses himself as the practical, documented example of how this extraordinary intervention could happen. He outlines a precise canonical path where a completely unknown, baptized layman, specifically him, Stephen Work, could be validly elected as the pope.
He does this deliberately to ground his sweeping theory in practical, actionable reality. He wants to move the discussion away from being a dryly theoretical theology paper and show the exact legal mechanisms required. He cites extensive pre-1958 Catholic canon law to demonstrate that this path, while exceptionally rare, is doctrinally valid.
I want to walk through that path because the mechanics of it are fascinating. How does a regular guy, a layman, actually become the pope of the global church?
It requires a sequence of rapid, precise canonical steps. First, there must be a valid, uncorrupted election by a purified college of cardinals. If they cast their votes for a baptized layman, and that layman accepts the election, canon law dictates that he immediately, in that very instant, receives supreme jurisdictional power over the universal church. He is legally the pope.
However, because he is a layman, he does not yet possess the sacramental capacity to perform the duties of a priest or a bishop.
Right. So step 3 is a rigorous verification of his original baptism to ensure he is actually a member of the church. Step 4 is the reception of holy orders through a process called per saltum, a Latin term meaning by leaping.
Oh, by leaping.
Yes. Normally, a man spends years as a deacon, then years as a priest before perhaps becoming a bishop. But in extraordinary crisis circumstances, this layman can be rapidly, sequentially ordained. He is ordained to the diaconate, immediately ordained to the priesthood, and then crucially, he is consecrated to the episcopate, made a bishop, usually by the cardinal dean of the college.
So it's a rapid-fire sequence. Boom, boom, boom. Deacon, priest, bishop in a matter of days.
Yes. Once that final episcopal consecration is complete, the process is finished. He now possesses both supreme global jurisdiction and the absolute fullness of the sacrament of holy orders. He is, in every sense, fully the pope.
Okay, so following this hypothetical, Stephen Work becomes the pope. But he doesn't just put on the white cassock and hold the singular office of pope. The blueprint calls for a triple office.
Yeah.
He holds 3 distinct, simultaneous roles. Let's break down each of these roles, starting with the spiritual.
The first role is the Pope of Rome. This is the supreme spiritual authority on earth, the ultimate guardian of dogma and theology. Crucially, to prevent the kind of corruption he diagnosed in the modern era, the author specifies that the Pope must be bound by a strict vow of personal evangelical poverty.
He must radically renounce all material gain, opulent wealth, or personal ownership, ensuring that his spiritual mission remains completely uncorrupted by financial incentives. And the second role is where the temporal power comes in. He is the monarch of the world, the king.
This represents the temporal authority. The king is the physical executor of justice in the temporal order, the sword arm of the Abrahamic court. And in his writings, the author adopts a highly specific, provocative title for this monarch: Stephen the Proud.
I spent a lot of time thinking about that title, The Proud, because sociologically it seems like a terrible branding choice for a global king. Usually throughout history, monarchs choose titles like Alexander the Great, Richard the Lionheart, or Louis the Just. They want to project perfection. Why choose the name of a sin?
It is a profoundly deliberate and theological choice. In traditional Christian theology, pride is considered the root of all other sins. It is the original failure of Lucifer, the desire to elevate oneself above God. By actively taking the title Stephen the Proud, the king forces himself to carry the name of the ultimate sin as a perpetual daily act of self-exposure and necessary public shame.
It serves as a constant, institutionalized check on his own ego.
It is a public reminder to himself and a clear invitation to all of his subjects to remain endlessly vigilant against the corrupting nature of absolute power. He is telling the world, this is my greatest weakness, watch me and help me guard against it.
It is a fascinating psychological mechanism. Its vulnerability and self-awareness built directly into the architecture of absolute global power. And the third role he holds.
The third role is simply the man, Stephen Sears' work. This represents the human person beneath the titles, a humble, flawed, mortal sinner who stands in complete solidarity with the rest of humanity, subject to the exact same moral laws, physical frailties, and ultimate divine judgment as every other citizen on earth.
Pope, king, man. It's a remarkable trinity of roles. But let's focus heavily on the king aspect, because he is the one actually executing the Abrahamic court's intense judgments. We talked about public tasering and executions. How does the king's power actually function in reality? Is he just a supreme global dictator with a massive army at his disposal?
This is perhaps the most critical distinction in the entire text regarding the structure of power. The king's power is entirely derivative.
Derivative, meaning he doesn't generate the authority to strike on his own.
Exactly. Article the 7th of the author's foundational treatise makes this absolutely explicit. The king possesses absolutely no autonomous, inherent right to rule over peoples, dictate laws, or conquer states. He cannot unilaterally open investigations, and he cannot direct the outcomes of court cases. His temporal authority flows entirely and exclusively from the prior constitution of the Abrahamic court and the specific written judgments that the multi-faith justices hand down. He is merely the faithful servant and the physical executor of those judgments.
If the court does not issue a ruling, the king's sword remains sheathed. So the court does the math, the court points the finger, and the king strikes the blow.
Yes. But how he chooses to strike is just as radical and unique as his title. The text extensively outlines the mechanism of the king's will. And the most surprising defining characteristic of this mechanism is that the king absolutely, categorically rejects the use of mass warfare.
No wars, no overthrowing corrupt governments with invading armies, tank battalions, or drone strikes.
None whatsoever. The author considers modern mass warfare to be an imprecise, brutal, and inherently unjust instrument because it inevitably slaughters thousands of innocent civilians, the homo umbrans who are just trying to survive, while the guilty leaders remain safely hidden in bunkers.
Instead of war, if a sovereign state or a massive corporation refuses to correct an injustice or submit to the court's ruling, the king deploys a tactic he calls exposure and clarity.
Surgical exposure. Let's build a realistic scenario to see how this works in practice.
Okay, let's imagine a powerful rogue nation run by a dictator is secretly operating a massive, illegal biological weapons program. The Abrahamic court discovers this, issues a ruling demanding it be dismantled, and the dictator simply ignores the court. Without an army to invade the country, how does the king force compliance?
When the dictator refuses to comply, the court formally petitions the king to act. The king's intelligence apparatus does not target the nation's infrastructure or its military bases. Instead, it surgically determines the specific individual human beings who are driving the program. The king identifies the dictator, the key generals, the lead scientists, and the financial backers hiding behind the state apparatus.
Then the king utilizes his global platform to publicly announce their names, their exact crimes against natural law, and their familial culpabilities. He doxes them, essentially, but with supreme, terrifying judicial authority.
He provides the global community of Abrahamic faithful with whatever precise information they require to focus massive, overwhelming corrective pressure directly on the human source of the problem. He strips the dictator and the generals of all sovereign immunity on a global scale. He effectively declares them outlaws to natural law.
This allows the collective moral, economic, and physical force of billions of faithful citizens around the world to instantly isolate, financially sanction, and physically apprehend those specific individuals. It is a surgical strike using absolute truth and radical transparency instead of tomahawk missiles.
He exposes their deepest secrets, he completely dissolves the legal fictions that protect the guilty from the consequences of their actions, and he empowers the global community to apply the necessary pressure. It bypasses the military entirely to avoid mass bloodshed.
It attempts to restore the moral order by holding the actual specific human decision-makers accountable for their lies, rather than making the innocent, propagandized citizenry pay the bloody price for their leaders' deception. We have covered an immense, almost overwhelming amount of ground today. I am going to try to synthesize the sheer scale of the architecture we just explored. We started down on the psychological ground level, diagnosing the modern citizen as homo umbrans, the shadow human.
We saw how our collective moral faculties have been wounded, our intellects darkened, and our wills weakened by decades of state-compelled lies, using the expansion of euthanasia and the shifting definitions of personhood as the primary symptoms.
To cure this deeply rooted disease, we explore the author's proposal for a severe Thomistic system of truth enforcement, a world where lying is legally recognized as a cosmic triple offense against God, justice, and charity. We examined a system that punishes deception not with fines, but with public shame, calibrated electrical pain, and for apex treason, the terrifying symmetry of lex talionis.
And we saw how that system demands global oversight. All of this is overseen by the Abrahamic Court, a multi-faith tribunal enforcing natural law, stripping away every corporate and diplomatic immunity, and holding even parents accountable for the moral formation of their children.
And finally, we arrived at the apex of the structure, the Pope-King. A ruler who takes a vow of absolute poverty and carries the title of the proud to remind himself of his own capacity for sin, wielding derivative power to surgically dismantle corruption through exposure, completely rejecting the bloodshed of modern warfare.
It is a remarkably cohesive, staggeringly complex blueprint for a totally different reality.
I want to bring this massive philosophical framework right back down to you, the listener. Think about your own daily life, your own habits within this theoretical world. How would your casual daily conversations change?
How would you approach your social media posts, your professional obligations at work, or the intense duty of how you raise and instruct your children if you knew with absolute terrifying certainty that artificial immunities simply did not exist?
But if you knew that the ultimate truth was ruthlessly and publicly enforced, and that every single lie you chose to amplify carried a guaranteed physical consequence?
It serves as a profound, perhaps uncomfortable thought experiment in personal accountability. And as we conclude, I want to leave you with one final, provocative thought that builds on the foundation of everything we have discussed today.
Let's hear it.
If you look closely at modern society, international diplomacy, and the entire interconnected global economy, you realize they are built almost entirely on a foundation of agreed-upon legal fictions. Corporate personhood, diplomatic immunity, limited liability, and the polite, everyday political compromises where everyone in the room knows the truth but collectively agrees not to speak it aloud.
These fictions, these artificial protections, are the essential grease that keeps the massive grinding machinery of the modern world turning without catching fire. They are the abstractions that provide us comfort and keep the peace.
Precisely. So the ultimate question is this. If a system like the Pope-King and the Abrahamic Court actually came into existence, if a global authority truly stripped away all of that protective grease, eliminating every fiction to impose absolute, unvarnished truth and instantaneous physical consequences, would human society heal and flourish in the light of reality, as the author hopes?
Would we finally stand up straight? Or, deprived of the fictions that cushion our interactions, would our civilization instantly fracture and collapse under the unbearable crushing weight of its own exposed secrets? We started this deep dive by comparing modern law to a broken X-ray machine, one that hides the deep fractures in our collective moral spine.
The author is proposing that we fix the machine, turn it up to maximum power, and strip away all the flesh to see the bone.
But the lingering question remains. If we are finally forced to see every single jagged line, every broken bone, and every hidden lie in the stark, unforgiving light of absolute truth, will we actually be able to bear the agonizing pain required to set it right? Or will the shock of the truth be the thing that finally kills us? Thanks for joining us on this incredibly intense journey into the Abrahamic justice system. Keep questioning the fictions around you. Until next time.